The slap echoed in the silence of the room, louder than even my mother's harsh words moments before. My hand still hung in the air, trembling as if it didn't belong to me anymore. I couldn't bring myself to look at her, at the stunned expression I knew would be on her face, at the pain I knew I'd caused. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest that it almost drowned out the sickening realization of what I had done. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. My mind replayed the moment in agonizing slow motion, the way my mother's voice had hissed in my ear, her words laced with venom, poisoning my thoughts. She had planted a seed, a doubt so insidious that it took root before I could even think to resist. Her accusations were sharp, her tone calculated. "She's not who you think she is," she had said, her eyes gleaming with some cruel satisfaction. "You don't know what she's hiding from you." I'd been angry, confused, and cornered. I wasn't thinking straight when I walked back into the room where my wife sat, unaware of the storm brewing within me. Her face, calm and trusting, only fueled the chaos in my mind. How could she sit there so serenely if what my mother said was true? I didn't ask questions. I didn't demand answers. I didn't give her a chance. And then it happened. The moment my palm met her cheek, I felt something inside me shatter. It wasn't just her trust I had broken, it was the foundation of everything we had built together. Her eyes widened not with anger, but with something far worse. Disbelief. That look cut through me deeper than any words could. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything to make it right. But I couldn't find the words. I couldn't explain what I didn't understand myself. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just stared at me, her hand lightly touching the red mark on her cheek, as if trying to convince herself it had really happened. In that moment, I felt smaller than ever before. What had I done? And worse, what had I let my mother turn me into? I turned away, unable to face the weight of what I'd become. But what I saw next shook me to the core. I sat alone in the dimly lit room, my head buried in my hands. The weight of what I'd done felt unbearable, pressing down on me like a vice. The image of her stunned face wouldn't leave my mind, and every second that passed made me feel more like a monster. My mother's words still echoed in my ears, but now they felt hollow, twisted, and wrong. I needed answers, not excuses, not guesses, just something to make sense of it all. That's when I noticed the envelope on the edge of the table, the corner of it sticking out from beneath the pile of old magazines. It was out of place. My mother had been sitting there earlier, fidgeting and shuffling things around as she spoke to me in her low, insistent tone. She must have left it there. Curiosity and dread battled within me as I reached for it. The envelope was plain, unmarked, and sealed. My name wasn't on it, but I knew it was meant for me. My fingers shook as I opened it, revealing a single sheet of paper folded neatly in half. The note was written in my mother's sharp, precise handwriting. It wasn't long, just a few sentences, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. "You should have listened to me sooner. She isn't who she says she is. If you want proof, check the box under the floorboards in the study. I told you to protect yourself, and now you'll see why." I read it again and then again, trying to process what it meant. My mind raced. What box? What proof? And why was my mother so desperate to convince me of something that sounded more like a conspiracy than reality? I wanted to crumple the paper, toss it away, and pretend it didn't exist. But I couldn't. A dark, gnawing curiosity had taken hold of me. Against my better judgment, I felt myself drawn to the study, to the very place my mother had pointed me toward. With each step, the floor seemed to creak louder, the shadows in the room seemed to deepen. I didn't know what I would find, or if I even wanted to find it. But I knew one thing for sure. This was no ordinary note. It was a warning, or perhaps the threat. As I sat there staring at the cryptic note, memories I had long tried to bury began creeping back into my mind. It wasn't just my mother's words today that unsettled me. It was everything they stirred up. My mother had never truly accepted my wife. From the very beginning, she'd found ways to subtly undermine her, planting seeds of doubt and suspicion wherever she could. At first, it was small things, offhand comments disguised as advice. "Are you sure she's the right one for you?" she'd ask, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "She seems different, not like us." Then, as our relationship grew stronger, her words became more pointed. She'd pull me aside during family gatherings, her voice low and urgent. "You need to be careful. People can hide their true selves for years." Or worse, she'd offer vague, cryptic warnings like, "There are things about her you don't know, things you should know." I brushed it off for a long time, thinking it was just her way of being protective, or maybe controlling. My wife didn't fit into the neat little box my mother had imagined for my life, and that had always been a problem. She was strong, independent, and unapologetically herself, and I loved her for it. But my mother's whispers weren't the only ones that lingered in the back of my mind. I remembered an old friend of mine, someone who had known my wife before I did, once giving me a strange look when I told him we were getting married. He hesitated, then said, "She's great, but, everyone has a past. Just make sure you really know hers." I'd laughed it off at the time, chalking it up to jealousy or some misplaced concern. Now, sitting here with this note in my hand, those words felt heavier than ever. Did my mother know something I didn't? Or was she just manipulating me, as she always had, to keep control of my life? Our family wasn't perfect. Secrets had always hung in the air like shadows, unspoken but ever present. And now, I couldn't shake the feeling that those shadows were creeping closer, threatening to consume everything I thought I knew. I couldn't sleep that night. The weight of what I'd done and the note my mother had left pressed down on me like a storm cloud, dark and unrelenting. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. The shock, the hurt, the disbelief etched into her expression. And worse, I saw the redness of her cheek, a cruel reminder of how I had let my anger and confusion get the better of me. But it wasn't just guilt gnawing at me, it was fear, raw and unrelenting. My mother's words, that note, the suggestion of something hidden beneath our lives. It all clawed at my mind like a beast I couldn't tame. I didn't know what scared me more. The possibility that she was lying, manipulating me yet again, or the chance that she was telling the truth. I started avoiding her, my wife, I mean. Every time I saw her, I felt a sharp stab of shame. She tried to talk to me, her voice soft, her eyes searching, but I couldn't meet her gaze. How could I? She deserved answers, and all I had were questions. At work, I couldn't focus. My colleagues noticed, but I waved off their concerns with forced smiles and half-hearted excuses. At home, I avoided lingering in the same room as her for too long. When she wasn't looking, I found myself staring at her, wondering if there was something I'd missed all these years. Some crack in the surface, some hidden truth my mother claimed to see. I started making calls, whispering into the phone when she wasn't around. Old friends, distant relatives, anyone who might know something I didn't. I told myself it was just to get clarity, to prove my mother wrong once and for all. But deep down, I wasn't sure what I wanted to find. My temper became shorter, my patience thinner. Every little thing set me off, not because it mattered, but because I couldn't handle the storm raging in my own head. I was unraveling, and I knew it. The worst part? She saw it. I could feel her watching me, her concern growing with each passing day. And still, I couldn't bring myself to tell her what was going on. Not until I knew the truth. Not until I figured out whether I was fighting my mother's lies or protecting myself from the truth I was too afraid to face. The connection came to me like a lightning strike. Sudden, blinding, and impossible to ignore. It started with a name. Just one name, scrawled hastily in the corner of another note my mother had left. I wasn't sure why I hadn't noticed it before, but once I did, I couldn't stop staring at it. Mira Thakur. The name meant nothing to me at first. It felt like another one of my mother's cryptic attempts to sow doubt, to plant seeds of suspicion without actually saying what she meant. But something about it tugged at the edges of my memory, like a puzzle piece I couldn't quite place. That night, while my wife was asleep, I sat down with my laptop and searched for the name. The results were surprisingly sparse, just a handful of articles, most of them local news pieces from over a decade ago. But one of them caught my eye. It was about a fire, a tragic accident, the article claimed, though there were whispers of something more sinister. The fire had destroyed a small house in a quiet neighborhood, killing an elderly couple who lived there. The name Mira Thakur appeared in the article as a witness, someone who had seen the aftermath and claimed the fire wasn't accidental. My heart started racing as I read further. The article mentioned a younger woman who had been seen leaving the house shortly before the fire broke out. The details were vague, but there was enough to make my stomach churn. The description of the woman, her age, her appearance, felt uncomfortably familiar. I couldn't stop myself. I kept digging, and the more I uncovered, the worse the sinking feeling in my chest became. Mira Thakur hadn't just been a witness. She'd been someone close to the victims, and somehow my mother had known her. There were photos of them together, smiling at events that looked formal but intimate. The connection between my mother and Mira was clear, but what shook me to my core was a grainy image from one of the articles, a photo taken at the scene of the fire. It was blurry, but there was no mistaking it. The younger woman in the photo looked almost exactly like my wife. I froze, the room spinning around me. Was it her? It couldn't be, could it? She'd never mentioned anything about a fire or knowing anyone named Mira or being connected to something so devastating. But if it wasn't her, why would my mother be so determined to link her to this? My mind raced with questions, each one darker than the last. Was my wife hiding something from me? Or was this another of my mother's twisted games, using some distant tragedy to manipulate me? One thing was clear, I couldn't ignore this anymore. This wasn't just about my mother's accusations or my wife's silence. There was something real here, something tangled and messy and dangerous, and I was caught right in the middle of it. The more I dug into my mother's past, the more I realized how little I truly knew about her. She had always been a strong, imposing figure in my life, someone who seemed to command respect without question. But now, as I pieced together fragments of her history, I began to see the cracks beneath her carefully constructed facade. It started with a box I found tucked away in the study, the one my mother had mentioned in her note. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, filled with old documents and photographs, but as I sifted through the contents, a chilling pattern began to emerge. There were letters, dozens of them, written in my mother's hand. Most were addressed to someone named Mira Thakur, and their tone ranged from pleading to threatening. One in particular stood out. "You need to stay quiet. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about all of us. If you speak, you'll ruin everything." Then there were the photos. Some were innocent enough, family gatherings and formal events, but others were different. One showed my mother with a man I didn't recognize, their expressions tense, as though caught in a heated argument. Another showed the same man shaking hands with someone who looked like a government official. And then there was a photo that made my blood run cold. It was of the house from the fire, the one Mira Thakur had spoken about in the article I'd found. My mother stood in the foreground, her face unreadable, but there was something unsettling about her presence in that place. At that time, the pieces were starting to come together, but they painted a picture I didn't want to see. My mother wasn't just a passive observer in all this. She had been involved, deeply involved, in something dark and dangerous. I confronted her about the box the next day, my hands shaking as I held up one of the letters. "What is this?" I demanded. "What did you do?" She didn't flinch, didn't even look surprised. Instead, she sighed and sat down, her expression calm but cold. "You're digging into things you don't understand," she said, "things that are better left buried." Her words only fueled my anger. Better for who? You? What did you do to Mira? What happened to that family in the fire? She didn't answer directly. Instead, she leaned forward, her voice low and steady. "Everything I've done for this family, for you. If you can't see that, then maybe you're not as smart as I thought you were." It was in that moment I realized the truth. My mother wasn't just protecting herself. She was protecting secrets that could destroy us all. And if she was willing to go to such lengths to keep them hidden, then the danger wasn't over. It was just beginning. I'll never forget the moment it all came crashing down. The moment I realized the truth behind everything. The slap, the doubts, my mother's cryptic words. It was like a floodgate opened and every piece of the puzzle fell into place. It started with a phone call. My mother called me late at night, her voice calm but insistent, asking me to meet her at the house she still called home. It wasn't a request, it was a command, the kind she'd issued my whole life, the kind I'd stopped questioning long ago. When I arrived, she was waiting for me in the study, her usual composed self. But there was something in her eyes that set me on edge, a flicker of desperation she couldn't quite hide. "I know you've been snooping around," she said, her voice sharp, "and I know what you think you found. But before you go jumping to conclusions, there's something you need to see." She handed me a file. At first, I didn't want to take it. I was tired of her games, her manipulations, but something about her expression, the way her hand trembled just slightly as she held out the file, made me take it anyway. Inside were documents, photos, and a single audio recording. The documents were a mess of legal jargon, but one word stood out: inheritance. It was about money, a lot of it, and it painted a picture of a bitter legal dispute between my mother and a woman named Mira Thakur. The photos were worse. They showed Mira with my wife, younger but unmistakably her. They were smiling in some, but others told a different story. They showed arguments, tension, fear. And then there was the recording. I pressed play, my hands shaking. The voices crackled to life, my mother's and Mira's. They were arguing, the words heated and sharp. "You think you can just take what's mine?" My mother spat. "You think money will fix this?" Mira shot back. "She deserves the truth, and I'll make sure she gets it." "She'll never believe you," my mother hissed. "She's my daughter-in-law now. She trusts me, not you." There was silence, then Mira's voice, quieter but firm. "If you don't tell her, I will." The recording ended abruptly, leaving me in stunned silence. That's when it hit me. My mother's actions weren't about protecting me. They were about silencing someone who knew too much. Mira had known my wife. She'd known something about her past, something my mother had gone to great lengths to bury. And the slap? It wasn't just anger or confusion. It was fear. I'd lashed out because I was terrified. Terrified of what my mother had planted in my head, terrified of the truth I wasn't ready to face, and now I had no choice but to confront it. I looked at my mother, the woman I'd trusted all my life, and for the first time I saw her clearly. "What did you do?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The truth was already staring me in the face. The truth came out like a dam bursting, unstoppable and devastating. There was no going back, no unlearning what I now knew. My mother had orchestrated it all, the lies, the manipulation, the constant whispering in my ear. She had poisoned my mind, turning my love into suspicion, my loyalty into control. And worst of all, I had let her. The slap was my breaking point, but it was also hers. My wife wasn't the type to stay silent, and for that, I was grateful. She confronted me, not with anger, though she had every right to be furious, but with a calmness that only made my guilt worse. "Why?" she asked me, her voice steady but her eyes filled with pain. "Why would you hurt me like that?" I had no answer. "Because I was weak," I finally said, "because I let her get in my head, and because I was too much of a coward to trust you over her." It wasn't enough, and I knew it wouldn't be. But it was the truth, and at least I could give her that. We sat together that night, the distance between us as vast as the silence that hung in the air. I told her everything: the note, the box, the recording, the photos of her with Mira, the inheritance fight, all of it. I expected her to explode, to walk away, to tell me we were done, but instead, she cried, quiet tears that broke my heart all over again. "Mira was like a mother to me," she said after a long pause. "She took me in when I had no one, and now I understand why she warned me about your family. She knew what your mother was capable of. I never thought you'd be capable of it too." Her words hit harder than the truth ever could. Over the next few days, things changed. She didn't leave, not yet anyway, but the space between us was undeniable. We talked more in those days than we had in years, and for the first time, I truly listened. She told me about her past, about Mira, about the sacrifices she had made to build a life with me. And I told her about my mother, the control she had wielded over me my entire life, and my fear of breaking free from her grasp. In the end, she made her decision. "I can forgive you," she said, her voice steady. "But I won't forget. If we're going to rebuild this, it has to be different. No more lies, No more control, and no more letting your mother dictate our lives. I nodded, knowing it was the only way forward. I had nearly lost her, and I wasn't about to make the same mistake twice. Our relationship wasn't the same after that. It was quieter, more fragile, but also more honest. We were rebuilding from the ground up, one piece at a time. And my mother? She was no longer part of our lives. That was a decision we made together. A boundary we set, not out of anger, but out of necessity. I'd learned the hard way that love isn't just about trust. It's about protecting it, even from the people you think you're supposed to trust the most.